Get started then. We'll start our work session for June 21st, 2022. Proposed board goals, and Dr. Adams, you're going to kick us off.
I think the superintendent's going to pick us up briefly.
Yes. Okay.
Good evening, directors. We set aside this evening work session to talk about our long-term goals. Had this conversation before. We came to agreement around some academic milestones that were focused around where we expect our students to be over time. These were focused on making sure that we were able to track our progress towards students' proficiency in our assessments, state level assessments. Tonight we're returning to that conversation. Dr. Adams is the main event here to walk us through, and you've seen this in the materials, what the recommendation is to get our conversation going around similar academic milestones. We're representing the transition to the measure used by the state as it holds schools and districts accountable to. So we'll get into more of that conversation, but I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Adams, who's the best person to lead this conversation.
Thank you, Superintendent. Good evening, Chair DePass, Vice Chair Scott, excuse me, board directors, student representative McMahon, welcome. Official kickoff by yourself. I'm pleased to be with you here tonight to share our proposal for board goals for the next 5 years. As you are aware, you've mentioned the current board goals end this spring, so the time is right for some opportunity to recommit to the success of all students in PPS. So first, I wanted to start by just talking about continuous improvement for just a minute. Successful school systems are constantly trying to improve their operations, performance, and outcomes. Here in PPS, one of the ways we look at a continuous improvement model is by following a pattern of planning, implementing that plan, studying the results of those efforts, and then making adjustments as needed to support continued momentum and progress towards our goal. This is the spirit of continuous improvement. It could also be thought of more simply as a series of 3 questions. What is our present state? Where are we? Who are we? What do the data say about us? 2, what is our desired state? Where do we wish to be? What does that look like? And 3, how do we get there? What will it take to bridge the gap between current performance and desired performance? How do we align our collective efforts in a unified direction for success? The proposed board goals that we will share tonight will allow for systemic alignment of purpose and effort that will hopefully help us realize continued improvement in outcomes for students as we're a school system and learning is our core purpose.
Dr. Adams, I really love this because I see the connection to what we did in our visioning process that really set our North Star as a district. That was the framework of when we started approaching the community is where are we and where do we want to be? And I remember in those sessions, there were these scenarios read about, okay, I can't remember what year it was, but it was when our current kindergartners will be graduating high school, 20, 30 something. And this is what the world is like. And this is what a PPS graduate will look like. And then it was our job to figure out what that was and then map how do we get there. And so I love that continuous improvement cycle continues to infuse all of our work.
The questions are simple but profound.
Very much.
Think about the answer to them. Thank you for that. In considering and proposing board goals, we follow some principles of effective measurement and goal calibration for continuous improvement. They're shown on the screen. First, we want every school to see themselves in one or more of the board goals. It needs to resonate. People need to see themselves. The goals should drive improvement at all levels, because all levels of school require progress based on our data. Second, every student should be expected to demonstrate achievement aligned to the grade level standards, the Oregon state standards. You'll note in here in these proposed goals, we're talking about using the Oregon State summative assessment. We will continue to also administer the MAP assessment so we can also monitor student growth towards proficiency, because we must keep an eye both on growth and proficiency in order to really change the outcomes for students. We believe that goals should represent a progressively rigorous ladder of achievement in English, language, arts, and mathematics. and that the goals should serve as a catalyst for improved outcomes for all of our students.
Sorry.
Yes, ma'am.
Are the summative assessments and the map assessments kind of what guide us in picking what our goals are? And are they the only ones that we use? Like, do we only use assessments to decide what goals?
Well, what I've seen in the previous version of the goals, Representative McMahon, was a combination of assessments and a portfolio, culminating event in grade 8, and then some post-readiness measures at high school. What I've spoken to the superintendent and Dr. Proctor about is standing up a separate graduate portrait report that would talk about that developmental continuum as she and her staff flesh that out as we go forward in the future. And so one of the reasons, as the superintendent mentioned, that we were suggesting the use of OSAS is because it's how our schools are held accountable. It's how they get into comprehensive school improvement status or targeted school improvement status. And they can only get out of those statuses by improving student outcomes on OSAS. And so we really think that having staff sort of looking at those data, thinking about those data in relationship to daily teaching and learning would be a pretty powerful alignment of efforts across the district.
And what I wanted to jump in and add is I want to be really clear that we don't pick the board goals based on the assessment tool. We pick the board goals, the places where we feel like we really want to see our students move forward and really can see some important levers, just like Dr. Adams said at the beginning, like so that each school has a goal. It's the very basic things. And then the assessments are the tools we use to measure our success in that. So, like third grade reading that we've had as our goal in the past and are looking at again, like that's when reading changes from kids learning how to read and then reading to learn. Fifth grade math is the point where if students are mastering in fifth grade math, then they have a much higher rate of success in advanced math in high school. That kind of like what third grade reading is to reading, fifth grade math is to math. And then we wanted to look at, readiness for high school, like from the middle school experience, if that's a successful experience, so kids are ready for that high school academic experience, and then that they're ready for a post-secondary path of some sort. So those are kind of like, that's why we chose the goals. And then it's like, okay, well, how do we measure that? How do we effectively measure that we're moving kids forward in third grade reading, fifth grade math, high school readiness, and post-secondary readiness?
When did we pick these board goals?
2019. And Maxine was on the board then, and she and I were partners for several of the rounds of brainstorming on these.
That brings up a question I have about, so we're rethinking them. We established these in 2019, we're rethinking them in 2022. Is there a reason why we go 5 years out rather than just a 3-year cycle? Is there some benefit to taking a longer horizon to?
Sure, certainly. So these gaps are generational, persistent, unacceptable, and hard to move. And so I also think that these goals should outlive any of us should we change administrations or board members come and go, right? It needs to not be limited to just the superintendent's term. These are goals for the system based on what the board may choose, how the board may choose to take action next week. And so reducing those gaps at least by half over the next 5 years, with the exception of graduation, which we're recommending we think we can actually close within 5 years, is rigorous, ambitious, and yet I believe it is achievable.
So since you raised high school, I'm just curious because it seems like it's actually become less rigorous. The goal currently, so the state has eliminated the essential skills requirement, and the current goals have post-secondary indicators about post-secondary readiness, and graduation currently in the state of Oregon, you just have to get D's in the core classes. So it seems like it's actually moving to a less rigorous standard.
So I would respectfully disagree when we have only 50% of our Native students meeting that standard, where we can only get 3 out of 4 Black or Latinx students to meet that standard. It seems like if it were less rigorous, we would have more students graduating. We're graduating 9 out of 10 Asian students, almost 9 out of 10 white students, and yet other student groups are lagging far behind in graduation rate.
So I'm asking though about the rigor of what we're expecting in our diploma and our secondary. So in theory, so I'm just, so we're saying
can I say
eighth
something real
grade, our expectation is we want students at eighth grade benchmark. And then the high school one is actually not a demonstration of proficiency or being at a benchmark. It's getting a D in a class.
So I would
I'm
argue
just
that-
curious about how that works. And then I say the elimination by the state of the essential skills seems like
Isn't that temporary though?
They're discussing graduation requirements
Okay.
as we
but
speak.
right now they're
Speak over.
suspended.
Yeah.
They're suspended across the country, typically.
So I'm curious, we're going from a setting a standard for post-secondary readiness. And we've always, of course, had our sights on graduation rate, but that I'm trying to see how that's a progressively more rigorous standard from eighth grade. So the eighth grade is proficiency. Then high school, we move off of the state test and move to graduation. So that's moving off of a proficiency standard since we don't have, since there's not expectation for proficiency for graduation.
Sure, but if you think of it like this, if students are leaving third grade reading, they're leaving elementary school with their mathematics skills, they're going to wind up in more advanced coursework, which means they will be meeting a more rigorous bar. Also, I think it's important to note that we're not losing the post-secondary indicators. We have a high school success plan, and it has 3 prongs to which high schools align themselves. One of those is graduation rate, one of those is post-secondary readiness, and the third is student engagement.
So is that something that's going to be included, or is just going to be
So
graduation
the high school success plan is its own standalone sort of strategic plan about high school efforts. And of the high school indicators, we are proposing graduation rate. So post-secondary readiness, while we are happy, I'm happy to report out on that, it is not what we're proposing for the high school goal.
Director Hollins, I had the same thing.
Oh, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Dr. Hollins?
Can you hear me?
If you're talking, we can't hear you.
See is closed captioning.
Can you hear me now?
Gary, can you hear us?
It looks like, is that little icon there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thanks. So I was just wondering if we can hear the whole presentation first before we start getting into each goal portion. Because I just want to make sure that if we're going to hear some of the other rest of the, and this is the end of the presentation, I would at least like to hear the whole presentation before we start getting into a lot of the questions, if you will.
The graduate portrait remains our North Star. We want all PPS graduates to be compassionate and critical thinkers who can collaborate and problem solve in order to leave the world a more socially just than they found it. Among the 9 essential dispositions of the graduate portrait is inquisitive critical thinkers with deep knowledge. Within this disposition, students demonstrate mastery of core academic knowledge and skills. Through the exploration of a range of disciplines, students emerge with fundamental skills in literacy, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, mathematics, and critical thinking. Tonight, I will present to you a set of academic benchmarks, think of them as temperature checks, along the pre-K to 12 continuum that will allow us in part to monitor every student's progress towards realizing the promise of the graduate portrait. We propose that we keep the grade levels represented by the last set of board goals, elementary, middle, and high school, and that we tweak the measures by which we monitor student performance. I'll go into more detail, but as you all know, those are currently third grade reading, fifth grade mathematics, eighth grade readiness, and there was a high school metric, and in this case, we're proposing graduation rate. In thinking about how we set goals for third, fifth, and eighth grade, I wanted to briefly share the methodology used to develop the proposed board goals and 5-year targets. Based on our work this school year, we now have 2 MAP scores for most students. This is important because MAP can help us predict student performance on the statewide summative assessment, OSAS. 2 assessments are highly correlated in a positive way. Just as a reminder, a correlation occurs when 2 scores move together in unison, and correlations can move in a positive direction or a negative direction. An example of a positive correlation is the more ice cream I eat, the more weight I gain. MAP and OSAS share this correlation, meaning that higher MAP scores indicate or predict higher OSAS scores. We should also mention the correlation strength. The strength of a correlation runs from 1 to -1. The closer to 1 the correlation is, the stronger it is, and therefore the more accurate the prediction. You'll note on the slide that the MAP OSAS correlations run between 0.83 and 0.91 in English language arts and mathematics, meaning that MAP achievement correctly predicts OSAS scores between 83 and 91% of the time. In setting the proposed board goals, we examined historical OSAS data and then used our OSAS predictions to understand gaps that we then determined could be closed or eliminated within 5 years. So our first proposed touch point and goal area is third grade reading. Reading is arguably the most important and critical skill we teach in school. Therefore, first and critical step along the graduate portrait continuum is preparing all students to read to learn by the end of grade 3. During the elementary years, students transition from learning to read to reading to learn. They move from learning alphabetic principles and decoding sight words to making deep meaning of text to which they are exposed. Foundational reading skills unlock the pathways for all the learning that students will be doing for the rest of their lives. Disciplinary literacy, the ability to read, write, and reason across a variety of content areas, such as science and social studies, for example, begins with the ability to independently and fluently read for information with great understanding. Reading is a civil right, and it's our responsibility to ensure that all students can read. The data on reading are clear. Students who do not read proficiently by third grade are 4 times more likely to leave high school without a diploma than are proficient readers. Moreover,
Can you say that again? 4 times?
4 times more likely. So students who do not read proficiently, by third grade are 4 times more likely to leave high school without a diploma than are their proficient peers. Moreover, we know that our institutions of incarceration are full of men and women who were not afforded the basic literacy skills that they deserve. We must ensure that all students are reading on grade level by the end of their third grade year. So how have we been doing? Let's look at our trend OSAS data for third grade. Until this year, the last time PPS students took OSAS was during the 18-19 school year. Overall, in 2018-19, nearly 70% of white students were meeting grade level expectations in reading by the end of grade 3. That compares to just 19% of African American students, 16% of Native students, 26% of Pacific Islander students, and 30 and 33% of underserved and Latino students, respectively. While a majority of white students are reading by the end of grade 3, most students of color are not. This slide.
Just in future presentations, or when we get the data, if you have it, of like what the opt-out rate is, just so we can understand what,
Sure.
how that might act.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Using the relationship between MAP and OSAS, we ran projections and predicted student proficiency in third grade reading for the current year. Again, while this slide shows a prediction, MAP correctly predicts OSAS between 83% and 91% of the time. At this time, we're predicting that 72% of white students will be proficient in third grade reading, while only 17% of African American students, 11% of Native students, and 33% of Latino students will be proficient readers by the end of third grade. The predicted gaps mirror the actual gaps of past OSAS performance. These gaps are persistent, they are large, and they are unacceptable.
I just wanted to sit with that for a minute, given like what you said about the people who are incarcerated and the 4 times less likely to finish high school, and to hear those numbers of 11% for our Native students. 70% for our Black students that are proficient, which means that we have, like you said, huge and unacceptable gaps in those spaces. And I feel like we hear that data and we know it's true, but when we sit in these moments, it's really powerful for us to think about what we as a school board can do by focusing on these goals to really try to focus that what could be life changing for kids. So thank you for bringing that data to us tonight, Dr.
I had a
Adams.
quick question about the data. Is that the N,
Yes, that's the
Okay.
count and the percentage.
the count?
The
and
count is to
percent.
the left
Okay, yes,
at the
thank
bottom
you.
of the bar, and the percentages to the right on the
Off to the
outside
right.
of the bar. Yes, ma'am.
Just on that. So in third grade reading, we only have.
Sorry, let me back up. This is the count of students who were proficient based on those who took the math assessment in each group. Excuse me, it's not the total N.
Okay, so just make sure I understand. So the two under the American Indian Native Alaska, the 11%, so essentially 20 students.
20, about 22.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question. As such, we're proposing that we focus our work to close these gaps between students of color and their white peers. Specifically, we propose to accelerate achievement for students of color by narrowing by half the opportunity and outcome gaps in third grade reading between students of color and their white peers within 5 years or by 2027, as measured by the third grade OSAS reading assessment. In other words, we propose that we cut the gaps in half over the next 5 years. And you'll see that that's a pattern as we go through subsequent touch points. Fifth grade mathematics is a critical touch point for a number of reasons. It's important for students to have a solid grasp on the foundations of mathematics established in elementary school in order to be effectively prepared for the rigor of middle school mathematics. As students enter middle school, the connections between mathematical areas of conceptual understanding become more complex, indicating a necessity for procedural fluency. Procedural fluency builds from an initial exploration and discussion of number concepts to using informal reasoning strategies and properties of operations to develop general methods for solving problems. One way to think of procedural fluency is to think of how quickly students can add, subtract, multiply, and divide with speed and accuracy, so that these skills will not hamper their ability to apply that knowledge to new information in order to arrive at correct and plausible mathematical solutions. Without a solid foundation in mathematics, students are at risk of falling into a mathematics gap of conceptual understanding, as they may experience greater challenges as they grapple to understand concepts through middle school mathematics and beyond. Successful completion of advanced high school coursework in mathematics is predicated on having a solid foundation established in elementary school. It is imperative that students receive grade level, high quality instruction every year in mathematics in order to realize the characteristics of critical thinking that we expect in the graduate portrait. Here are on the screen before you now are our fifth grade mathematics trend data for OSAS. As you can see, back in 2018-19, 55% of white students demonstrated proficiency in fifth grade mathematics. Students of color do not perform as well and are lagging behind. Under this metric, no Native students were proficient in mathematics in 2018-19. Only 6% of Pacific Islander students and 10% of African American students demonstrated proficiency in math, while underserved students demonstrated a proficiency rate of 19%, and Latino students achieved a proficiency percentage of just 22%. Leaving elementary school with a strong mathematical foundation is critical to future success, and we must do something to address these data. Looking ahead to our OSAS predictions for fifth grade math proficiency based on our math data, we can see the differential performance that is projected to persist between and among student groups. There's projected to be a 41 percentage point gap between the performance of Pacific Islander students and their white peers. Furthermore, we're projecting gaps of slightly larger than 30 points each between African American students, Native students, underserved students, Latino students, and their white peers. These data to me are an urgent call to action.
Dr. Adams, you said on the last slide that N is the number of students who took the test or the total?
That's the number of students who were proficient. Of those who tested, that's the count represented by the percentage.
So the N is those who took, okay, proficient who took the test.
We took the test, yes.
So similarly to third grade reading and fifth grade mathematics, we're proposing that we narrow by half that opportunity and outcome gap, or those gaps rather. Minding our proposal is to mind multiple gaps at the same time between students of color and their white peers by the fall of 2027 as measured by Osas.
May I ask a quick question about the count? It's a little tangential, but that's my phone that I looked up. So would if there's only 2 people in the universe that you're testing,
There were more than 2. There were only 2 that were proficient.
2 that were proficient out
Yes.
of, I'm just, okay, thank you. I understand. It doesn't, my question was not related to that necessarily.
So
Sure.
while you're on this.
I wanted to find out if there were more proficiency, I mean, how that percentage would move. I thought if only 2 people took the test, but
Oh, I
only 2 that were
understand. Yes.
proficient out of that, out of the total N, the total universe. I thought the percentages might go up a little bit if there were more counts.
And the denominator is higher.
Right, that's right. Okay.
You had a question, Director German?
Yeah, combined between this slide and the next slide, and actually it's across all the goals. When you say student of color, if you stay on the slide, referring to students of colors who are underserved, or what does that include? Because, for example, the multiracial not underserved, actually here in math are outperforming white students. So in your definition of students of
Right.
color, who's
We're jumping ahead just a little bit. I mean, each of the student groups that have a gap. So Black students as a group, Latino students as a group, Pacific Islander students as a group compared to their white peers, each individually, not creating a super group. But I have a chart in the presentation that sort of will show you the percentage point gains for each of the groups. Is toward the end, slide 22.
Were you looking more for a definition of who's included in those categories?
yeah, I think that answers it. So you're saying it's dynamic, or it's even though the narrative is students of color, it actually is a subgroup.
I'm looking at each group of students of color individually. Is what we
Okay.
do.
So it might be a parentheses with who those subgroups are actually.
Sure. 8th grade readiness. So we know that high schools are telling us that students are showing up not prepared for the rigors of high school coursework. And so when students exit grade 8 ready for the complexities and rigor of high school, a world of possibilities and coursework opens for them. 8th grade students should be prepared to navigate and adapt to high school's complex challenges, and reading, writing, and performing mathematics on grade level is one of the key ways by which we can ensure they are adequately prepared. Entering high school with grade level proficiency in English language arts and mathematics positions students for more advanced coursework. That advanced coursework in turn creates and strengthens college and career readiness of students. So you can think of 8th grade readiness as a gateway to post-secondary success. Conversely, students who enter high school without mastery of core academic knowledge face barriers to a successful high school experience and are often relegated to lower level coursework. If we want every student to have the opportunity to experience the full range of high school coursework, CT, CTE, arts, AP, advanced placement, IB, and more, we must commit to adequately preparing them for such by ensuring that students are proficient in both English language arts and mathematics by the end of grade 8. When we think about measuring 8th grade readiness, again, we examine proficiency in both English language arts and mathematics by the end of that year. Here again, majority of white students demonstrated this proficiency, while few students of color did the same. 55% of white students were proficient in both reading and mathematics in 2018-2019, compared to 34% of Native students, 20% of underserved students, 21% of Pacific Islander students, 23% of Latino students, and just 7% of African American students. These data continue to show that we're not serving all students well, nor are we adequately preparing them for the rigors of high school coursework. Looking ahead at our Osas predictions for this year, we can see that based on our MAP results, it's projected that just 3% of Black students, 8% of Pacific Islander students, 9% of underserved and Latino students are projected to end grade 8 demonstrating grade level proficiency in both English language arts and mathematics. We're projecting a 26 or 27 percentage point gap between Latino, Pacific Islander, and underserved students and their white peers, and a 32 percentage point gap between African American students and their white peers. Given these stark predictions, we know we must do better in preparing students for the rigors of high school. And so similarly to third and fifth grade reading and fifth grade mathematics, our eighth grade readiness goal again is looking at those gaps and narrowing them by half over the next 5 years, ensuring that students are demonstrating grade level proficiency in both English language arts and mathematics.
So this is a stupid question, but I'm just looking at the last goals we had and these ones, and it doesn't actually say it, but I'm thinking that you're moving from growth to proficiency as what we're measuring.
Yes, and because these are the proficiency measures are the statewide and federal accountability measures for school. We will still monitor growth and report on growth and measure growth because that's important. And we want schools and school teams to feel the success of growing students, even if they haven't grown quite enough to cross that proficiency bar yet.
And I'm not at all disagreeing. I just want to make sure I understand.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
that's a big shift. I mean,
Yeah, it is.
from where we were before. And again, I argued for proficiency, so I'm not opposed to it. I just want to make sure,
Mhm.
because it didn't actually say either growth or proficiency. So
Great point. That could have been clearer. Thank you.
it's not a criticism at all. I'm trying to make sure it's understood.
To be explicit, when we say OSAS, we're gauging proficiency.
But tracking growth, so we well.
Successful completion of high school leaves students prepared for whatever their future might take them, college, military, or career. We want our students to have infinite possibilities for their future based on following whatever dreams they might have. This often cannot happen without successfully completing high school with a diploma. Failure to complete high school creates a future earnings gap that cannot be bridged later in life. As an example, in 2019, full-time workers aged 25 and older had a median weekly earnings of $975. Those without a high school diploma had weekly earnings of just $606 compared to $749 for high school graduates with no college experience. And finally, in addition to the opportunity to earn higher income, we know that high school graduates also, because of things like income and career, also gain access to better living conditions, healthier foods, better healthcare and services. In late January, we shared graduation data for the class of, 2021. We celebrated our overall success in the aggregate, and we also noted that the disaggregated graduation data revealed that we still have work to do. To recap, all student groups achieved graduation rates greater than 75%, with the exception of Native students and Pacific Islander students, who earned graduation rates of 50% and 73% respectively. While the overall graduation rate in PPS increased, persistent gaps between student groups remain and require focused attention. Only 3 in 4 African American and Latino students graduated on time within 4 years, and currently there's a 13 percentage point gap between African American students and their white peers, and a little higher than 13.5 percentage point gap between Latino students and their white peers. Moreover, the largest gap is currently between our Native students and their white peers at 38.5 percentage points. While our graduation data certainly looks a fair bit better than our assessment data, there are still persistent gaps that demand our attention. And as such, instead of having the graduation gaps here in PPS, we are proposing that we eliminate them completely. By eliminating that graduation gap between students of color and their white peers by the fall of 2027. I've worked in the district and been part of continuous improvement work where we've closed the graduation gap between white and Black students and know that it's possible. Even more after my 8 months here, I believe it's possible here. I believe all these goals are possible with focused intentionality and appropriate supports and structures. This is all within our reach. So we have shared information on proposed goals and now wanted to quantify those goals and their targets by sharing information on what significant progress towards those goals looks like in terms of either having or closing the achievement and opportunity gap. This table shows the percentage point gains that would need to be achieved each year for the next 5 years in order to either narrow or close the gaps in student performance. Again, for 3rd grade reading, grade 5 mathematics, and 8th grade readiness, we are proposing cutting that gap in half over the next 5 years. Since different student groups have different differential achievement, each student group will have its own yearly target to map a trajectory of having the gap over the next 5 years. To obtain these, we noted the gap, divided it by 2, and then divided that quotient by 5 to establish a yearly target. For graduation, where we propose eliminating the gap, we took each student group's gap and simply divided it by 5 to establish that target. It's important to note that these targets were established using predictions and may need slight adjustments when we have our actual OSAS data in the fall, and I believe it comes in September. I'm not sure if it'll technically be fall or still technically be summer when we get the data. The language of the proposed goals allows for agility in adjusting the yearly targets while maintaining the overall goal of having the achievement gap by 2027 for over the next 5 years.
So, Dr. Adams, just to use an example here, in the Pacific Islander row for graduation, you've calculated 3 percentage point growth each of the next 5 years to eliminate the graduation gap as compared to your white peers.
Yes.
That's assuming white peers stays exactly the same.
Right.
So just a question about that. So let's just take graduation. That
Director Brimmer, without one more slide, can I just do that one and then we can take your question?
fine.
Thank you. In summary, I believe these goals and targets are strongly and transparently will signal our need to double down on our equity work on behalf of our students. For times now, I'd like to recap our what, why, and our how. What? We have an urgent need to accelerate achievement and performance for students of color here in PPS. Why? We have a series of critically important instructional benchmarks and indicators, such as reading, mathematics, high school readiness, and graduation, among others, that demonstrate chronic underperformance of students of color. How? We will leverage systemic investments and supports to close or half these gaps within 5 years. And with that, I am happy to have all the conversation and stop talking for a minute. Thank you
Thank
for your
you.
attention. Director Marimba, you had said something about graduation.
Curious on two questions on each of the 3rd, 5th, and 8th. After the slide where you have the 3-year projections, you have a slide that has the actual numbers, and I'm wondering if we could have that also for high school graduation.
Sure, I can send our previous graduation report to board director so you have those.
It would be helpful to have it like a similar construct so that so we see like only 3 students are proficient. Well, out of X number. So like what actually those numbers are.
Sure.
And then I'm curious, just like high school graduation and some of the other ones. Actually, is the largest by number that, for example, graduation, the Asian and also the multiracial not underserved groups actually have higher performance than white.
Yes.
Are you proposing, just trying to understand that regardless of who is the highest rate that the gap we're closing is, even though they're not the highest, is with the white group? And I'm just trying to clarify.
Yes, and that's why on this chart there's a dash there because there isn't an achievement gap in the direction of Asian students as compared to their white peers.
And the purpose of using that is just that is
Well,
that's
So go ahead, let me let you finish the purpose of
I'm
that.
I'm trying to understand, because I'm thinking like, hey, we want to have, like, it seems like we want all our students, if our framework is all students are capable of achieving at the, you know, highest rate, or there's not a gap between any, we choose the highest group to benchmark off of,
Well,
to be closing the gap with, or
not when I'm thinking about our equity work. When I'm thinking about our equity work, I'm really thinking about our Black and Brown students and their performance as compared to their white peers, because their white peers are typically outperforming them as well as their Asian peers. But that first benchmark is really against the white student group, and we hope to exceed that and eliminate all the gaps across the board. But I believe it's more of an equity-based conversation along the lines of race when we can successfully talk about how our Black and Brown students are doing against their white peers in terms of performance.
I like that we're starting kind of with the end in mind, you know, envisioning what it looks like for all students to succeed. I had a question about the map. So you talked about in the methodology, you're like, just for instance, if there's a 50% achievement gap, that you divide that by 5. And
Divided it by half first, because we're talking about cutting it in half.
Okay,
in
half
5 years.
first and then divide by 5. I
Yes.
thought I missed it, so I was wondering if, I was like, that math is too simple. What if we exceed a target in year 1 or year 2? What do we recalibrate? How do we? Because the methodology is based on, like, you know, we're going to all
Study
these
progress,
assumptions,
right?
right?
Sort of study progress.
And then something happens, you know, in year 3, and then how do you adjust?
I would suggest, because we know performance can be differential, and it
Mhm.
can and probably will vary, that is one of the reasons we set a 5-year target, because it gives us time to adjust.
Mhm.
We might make 3 percentage point gains next year for a certain group, but might make 7 the year after that, and sort of make up some of the gap, right? We know that we're placing high quality instructional materials in the hands of teachers with job embedded, just in time professional learning, and that should make an impact in these data, and that's going to take some time. And it's going to be differential, right? The first time I opened my curricular resources as a teacher, I wasn't as good as my last year in the classroom, because I
Right.
needed time to grow into that as well.
Right.
It's a good
Are
question.
we going to be dynamic then, in terms of our response will be dynamic? We'll be able to respond to what we see rather than what we've put on paper. What the assumption that's the
I
model
think we
is
could,
based
right?
on these assumptions. When the assumptions change, question is, like, how do we address when the assumptions change?
Well, I would believe if we saw something going drastically wrong or off course, the superintendent, myself, Dr. Proctor, we would bring a different recommendation to the board for some kind of different help. You know, what are the different supports we need? Because what we're doing doesn't appear to be getting us the result that we want, right?
And
It's a good question, and you know, these would be sort of targets, because I don't think we should expect these equal increments of improvement over the 5 years. We know from school and district improvement, you know, if you stay true to theory of action, some action steps, it tends to be a slow then steep curve for a few reasons. I know Dr. Proctor's on the screen too. For example, when you adopt new curriculum, it tends to be an implementation dip while people are learning, exploring, and getting used to those new materials. So you might see a smaller increment of improvement the first and second year, and then suddenly you start to see more dramatic. But you know, we're still aiming for that 5-year mark to happen. Now, if we accomplish that beforehand, great. That would be good. If we notice that the improvement is more than we might have expected, it's worth investigating what kind of work was being done there. The combination of what factors are contributing to that rate of improvement. For example, you will see it across the school portfolio. We're talking about this in the aggregate as a district. What happens when you notice some schools are producing greater rates of improvement than others? That's a great question for our principal supervisors and principals as a professional learning community to say, these 3 schools are knocking it out of the park. Like, what is the activity that's occurring there? And
Yeah,
that's a
that
great
would be my
conversation.
follow-up, is
Right.
how we're monitoring, you know, at that kind of granular level. And yeah, we would want to see a parabola, right? You'd want to see this a steep growth curve at some point in the future, so.
We are, Dr. Proctor and myself have, we have a weekly meeting with the principal supervisors. And we're trying to make sure that the school improvement plan becomes a living, breathing document. And so in our planning for next year, we're planning to embed some data dive processes in those weekly meetings. So every month we're talking about literacy achievement and mathematics achievement and student behavior on a cyclical basis. So that the expectation would be that principal supervisors are having those same conversations with the building leaders, and the building leaders are having those conversations with their teachers and their teaching teams.
And all focused on the same.
Trying to get everybody rowing in the same direction.
Right.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Adams, you said during your presentation, these gaps are generational, persistent, or two other.
Unacceptable.
Thought there was a fourth as well.
I did too, but.
I didn't have that written down.
It
so I
was-
didn't tell you
whatever
that
you
was
said
great.
was
I'm gonna go back
fire.
to the tape. I think it was generational, persistent, unacceptable. Maybe two.
Yeah.
The reason why I asked, because I'm sort of interested in your professional judgment on you know, as we sort of look at these as board goals, it feels like there's a couple ways to look at it, right? On the one hand, these gaps are generational, persistent, unacceptable. If we can have them, that feels like a huge win. At the same time, 5 years from now, knowing that we're still going to have persistent gaps is troubling to all of us. And I know it's just as troubling to you as it is to us as a board, right? And so, you know, I would love to say, well, why don't we eliminate the gaps, right? And I guess from your professional sort of, you know, looking at this as a generational problem that is persistent and unacceptable, have there ever been school districts that could have eliminated these gaps in a 5-year period of time? And what I'm really getting at, because I've been dealing with performance measurement in government for a long time, the goal, which is hard to do, is to set a target, which is a stretch goal, but it's still achievable. And I think getting back to, you know, Chair DePass's point, we should revisit these every year, because if we're making great progress, then I don't think we want to change all the time, but 2 or 3 years in, we might say, hey, you know what, we're already close to halfway, so we're gonna set a target up further. If we're not, then we need to be asking some questions. Is it a resource issue? Is it a training issue, curriculum issue? Like what are those things after a couple of years of doing that? But I guess I'm just getting that it feels to me like this would be a huge win. At the same time, I could see the community saying, well, wait, you're still gonna have a big opportunity gap. Can you just talk a little bit about that in sort of the
Sure.
context of schools generally?
Sure. So, you know, in continuous improvement and having been a teacher and an assistant principal, you want to make sure you're setting goals and you're not setting them so ambitiously that you're going to always feel like a failure and never feel like you're making any success, but yet you still want them to be rigorous and attainable. If we can successfully get on a trajectory where we're moving towards closing the gap in half, I will be doing backflips to come and talk to you about eliminating it. But I think we need time to see how our strategic planning efforts and our big bets are going to pan out. And I didn't want to set us up for failure by saying we can do this in 3 years, because I don't. I think change in a large system takes longer than that.
And there's no evidence that anybody's ever.
Right, I've not seen that story, that someone has closed or eliminated them in 5 years. I've seen it in graduation, but I've not seen it since we've gone to the Oregon State standards or every state's version of the Common Core curriculum.
About that one district in Atlanta, in Georgia, I thought was eliminated. I don't know, it's not a
They
big.
made some good reading games,
Okay.
again, because they stay focused on the primary grades, a science-based approach to reading. So, which is why you see it as one of our action steps. Literacy in the primary grades is attending to that as a way to, you know, accelerate growth and proficiency in third grade reading, particularly when you see the numbers, what they are, and how that can be predictive, and making it more challenging, you know, across the other grade levels too. So it's the combination of the improvement strategies at every one of these grade levels. You know, that's a whole array and body of work to stay consistent in our fidelity, in our implementation, in our progress monitoring, professional development, and accountability internally. to see the kinds of results that we want to see. But we're optimistic if we stay on our blueprint, we might. If we lose our way and lose our focus and attend to other shiny objects, maybe not.
And thank you. And I see Director Hollins has his hand raised.
Yeah, I'm gonna put mine up, but I know she had hers up as well.
And okay.
Mine's real foundational, like very easy, not like a comment wrapped up in a question. It's like purely, it's my first meeting, so I don't really know what's going on here. But Director Hollins, you're welcome to go first.
No, go ahead.
So I'm wondering, are these the same board goals that we had from before, and we're just like reevaluating? Yes. Okay.
They're the same goal areas.
Goal areas, but they're different specifically.
Right. The measures are different because they were post-secondary readiness, 8th grade graduate portrait, and growth on the MAP assessment. And part of the feedback, I've been listening every time we've had conversations around the board goals or the superintendent's evaluation template, which should, I believe there's a will to have that incorporate board goals in it, around wanting there to be consistent measurements where we can have those, right? So why is it, one of the comments I remember was either Director Green or Director Collins. So like, why is it MAP at this grade level and OSAS at this other grade level? And why can't it just be MAP across the board, OSAS across the board? And so that was some of the feedback we took into consideration. I also remember very clearly, I think we must continue our focus on our Native and our Black students. I believe raising achievement for them will raise achievement for all students because those strategies and that equity work will have a targeted universalism. At the same time, I heard very clearly that were we not, by not minding and saying we're minding the gaps of other student groups, are we not paying attention to them? Now, my belief is we are, but these goals really call that out by the matrix approach of looking at the different targets for the different student groups.
I think they're also different though, because when I first got on the board in 2019, we were talking about, there was this conversation to Director Brevitter's point about growth versus proficiency. Do you remember?
It's a totally different measure.
It's a different measure. And
So
so
they're the
that's
same topics, but they're different measurements.
the
Sort
third
of.
That's a
grade
great
reading,
Third and fifth.
fifth
the
grade
others are
math,
different.
eighth.
What? Sorry.
The four areas that we're looking at, specifically the third grade reading, the fifth grade math, and then the eighth grade readiness, they're the same. We're looking at the same, those same areas.
Actually, the eighth
The
grade
eighth
was
grade
supposed to
was-
be
Oh.
a
Portfolio
more
based.
portfolio, but that wasn't developed. So we, as a backstop, we just had the language arts and math.
Yeah.
But it was supposed to be something fuller than just, so it wasn't just all about test scores.
So it was, so wasn't it like high school readiness or
Not
Post-secondary
eight-
readiness.
post-secondary? Oh, it was
Yeah.
post-secondary. Okay.
Well, then the high schools were, if, actually, Larry, I forward you, they were C or better in advanced placement, international baccalaureate, dual credit, a CTE.
Three course strand in
And
any
of
of
course,
those.
strands, CTE, the seal of biliteracy, and then there was discussion about potentially putting an arts sequence so that students could show like readiness in different areas, that it wasn't just like college prep, but it also could be CTE. So it was not graduation, although obviously graduation being super important to the district generally, but it wasn't part of it.
And I always felt like we completely missed so many of our kids by the time they're in high school, and we're talking about IB classes. If they can't read, they're not even going to want to go to high school. So, Director Hollins, thanks for your patience.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
All right. So I have a few questions, actually more than a few. I'm going to kind of piggyback on what Director Scott said as far as why we're not looking at closing the achievement gap. When I hear, we want to make sure that we are having reachable goals. And this is just my opinion. I feel that we're kind of lowering our expectations to getting our kids to close that achievement gap. When you look at things that,
we have accomplished as a human race in general. It wasn't, we didn't have Harriet Tubman saying, well, she only want to get halfway to freedom, or we didn't have, the Wright brothers talking about they want to get partly up in the air, or we want to get halfway to the moon. These were goals and ambitious goals that we had to accomplish something, and to get our kids to something. And I think if we're going to set the, as a board, if we're going to set the direction, we have to be setting the direction that we're looking at closing the achievement gap, not halfway, not 3/4 of the way, but all the way. Our kids are already behind. We need to continue to look at closing the gap. And I love the matrix that we're using and how we have it broken down by what we need to get every year. So I'll just say that on that point. Other thing is that, when we talk about board goals, I think the vision of 5 years is great. But I think as a board goal, those percentages that he has in here, I think those should be our goals for each year. Because when we're making our business plan, we do a 5-year plan out, but then we do year by year, then we do month by month for the first year or two. And so I think having those board goals for this year, as this being our goal, knowing that we have a vision, as a 5-year vision, I think it should be structured in that manner. And another thing I look at is, as an employer, when we have kids that are not ready for the workforce, it is hard. And I mean, graduating from high school, it is, and they don't have the skills level. They're regulated to lower paying jobs, even if they do graduate, if they don't have the necessary skill level to do skilled work. And I've seen this over and over where we have graduates come in and, some of the basic things that that we would think they would know, they do not. And so while we're talking about, the income gap piece, it's even wider because our kids are not getting the education that they need in order to perform out here in this job. And I pose a question for all of college graduates, all the college graduates here. Do you think the kids that we have are Black, and I'm talking about our Black and brown kids, could they perform at the colleges you guys went to right now? And I don't think they could, And so when I hear us talking about, what we need to do, I think we need to be more audacious. I think we don't need for us adults to feel that we're setting ourselves up for failure. This is our kids, and our kids need to have a goal that they can obtain. We need to set that goal for them to be able to reach, as we go into the future. So that's one thing. I have a question though. So when we're talking about this 5-year plan, what does this mean for the students as they're going through this piece? So if I look at this 5-year goal and I have a second grader or a third grader, are they not going to be reaching that benchmark in that first or second year as they get ready for 8th grade? Then they're not going to be ready. So are we going to have this lag of kids that's not going to be ready? That's the question. Are we going to have a lag of kids that's not going to be ready?
So if I understand the question, I mean, I think our goal is to improve outcomes for students immediately, and that there not be any lag. And we know we're putting and investing resources to try to make that happen. So I can't say that there won't be lag, but I would hope that there would not be.
So if there is a potential lag, say from the 2nd grade to the 3rd grade or 3rd grade to 4th grade, are there any precautions or anything we're inputting to get those kids to a certain level by the time like the 8th or 9th or 10th grade? Because they were already
intervention.
Sure, this is why we've worked to provide going into next year learning acceleration specialists, focus in on Black and brown students and trying to help teachers in classrooms raise their achievement. I know I can't speak as intelligently about it as Dr. Proctor could, but I know that's one of our strategies is to get help immediately where it's needed the most. because we know students have gaps. We know that all of our instruction has not been grade level and standards aligned, and that in order to get there, we're going to need to provide scaffolds for students and for teachers.
And last question that I have is based, I'm talking about the graduation rate piece. And I think I asked this question before. So if we're having I'm talking about Black and brown kids or our Native kids who are at 19% in, third grade reading and 10% in math. And so I'm assuming by the time they get to 8th grade, they're not going to be 8th grade ready either, based on those numbers. What do that mean for those that graduate? Are they graduating with proficiency, or are they just graduating based on what?
So I would say that they're graduating based on completing their coursework and meeting both the PPS and the Oregon graduation requirements. I know that high schools are telling us that they're doing amazing work at scaffolding for students who show up not reading and doing math on grade level. Although it can be better, and we can help that be better by making sure our elementary and our middle school students are better prepared. That's really the way to fix that, because then the students are on track for advanced coursework. They're on track for not necessarily just getting the bare minimum grade to pass a course and so forth.
So does the bare minimum that we have to graduate, is that tied into proficiency?
I guess it would depend on your definition of proficiency, right? Is it proficiency in my English 11 class as measured by my grade? I mean, that's the way graduation is really measured. It's about grades and credits.
So
That's
I guess
proficiency. Excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt you. That's
go ahead.
Proficiency than a test score, for sure.
So you could graduate based on the minimum requirements that it needs to be graduated, whether that's a D or whatever, but not be proficient.
Well, there's a roll-up effect that we're trying to go for. If you can hear me, can you all hear me?
Yes,
We can.
Okay, great. So, just thank you all for, your questions, and kudos to Dr. Adams and the team for the presentation. So when we talk about goal setting is really intended for a period of time. So in this instance, 5 years. The question about whether or not there would be a lag in students achieving or attaining towards the goal, the aim is no, there wouldn't be a lag. So in the example that was raised to say, if I have a second grader, first grader, or even a kindergartner who is not named explicitly in these particular benchmarks identified for goals, know that with the strategies and the priorities that we've placed and put in place for all students, we are then prepping and preparing students from kindergarten, first grade, and second grade to ensure that they have what they need in order to meet that third grade goal. And because this is over a 5-year period of time, we are working diligently, obviously, with our third, so because we have a 5th grade math goal, for example, it doesn't mean that we are not doing deep work at the 4th grade math, 3rd grade math, 2nd grade math, etc. Because again, those strategies and priorities that we've put in place, namely adopting curriculum and identifying an instructional framework, being really intentional about teacher professional learning so that they can implement these particular strategies, specific targeted strategies, again, for our Black and Brown and Native students. All of these things combined really represent a recipe to help us meet all aspects of the goal. So then there's that roll-up effect again, when we look at 8th grade readiness. Because if you notice, 8th grade readiness includes both proficiency in reading and math, right? So by the time we are preparing students, and as we continue to do the work and implement our particular strategies and monitor the outcomes on a regular basis, then we would start to see a continued meeting of goal areas. So when graduation, again, is the goal, know that we have a high school plan that encompasses instruction, encompasses high quality readiness in a variety of academic areas. And it encompasses the rigor that is needed. Yet, at the same time, we've been doing work in the middle school levels and at the high school levels about grading equity. And there's equity in when we ask teachers to examine deeply their grading practices, then no longer will a student be able to a student who is able to meet the requirements of a particular course for graduation, that course will have a level of rigor attached to it so that students are then meeting some academic gains. And going back again to the roll-up effect, that when you definitely have 8th grade students who by the end of their 8th grade year are able to, as you have increasing numbers of 8th grade students who are able to demonstrate proficiency in reading and math by the end of the 8th grade year, again, it feeds into what will be ultimately our graduation goal. And while my understanding, and Dr. Adams could speak about this, while the state has paused on the assessment as a part of the graduation requirement, my understanding is that was a result perhaps of COVID, and that there is also, again, opportunities there because our high school students do take PSAT, ACT, and they still are able to take the state assessment as well at the high school level.
Okay, so, and I appreciate the explanation, but I didn't really think I got my question answered. So when I'm to the question, so when I'm looking at the statistics that you guys are presenting, and I look at, if we're at 10% right now, and then the next year, going by your projections, we'll be at 15%. So that means that year, 85% are not meeting. The next year, when you go up to 19.5, that means 80 of them is not. So each year, even though the number is getting smaller, we're still having a percentage of folks that are not going based on the projection that you guys have here. So I'm asking, what happens with those kids?
Well, I believe we keep working with them to build them up to standards. If you don't meet it by the end of 2nd grade, hopefully we get you caught up by the end of 3rd and you're reading on grade level. The only way to, and if I'm understanding your question, Director Holland, the only way to really ensure that would be to set a goal of 100% for next year.
No,
And that
not saying that. No, not saying that. All I'm saying is, what are we going to do for those other 85 the first year, the 80% the that year, the 76 the next year, the 74% the next year after that, and the 72 or the 68 the next year. Those are the gaps that we're going to have in this 5-year period that you're talking about. We're going to have 85% that's not meeting, 80% that's not meeting, 70%, 76% that's not meeting, 72 that's not meeting, and 68 that's not meeting. What are we going to do with those kids in that 5-year piece? Because if you look at the total number of kids, that's a lot of kids.
It's a lot of kids who have not been meeting proficiency expectations at their grade level historically, generationally. So it doesn't mean that, to your point, that we're not continuing to support their learning. part of the solution is we teach them in more effective ways. You'll notice that the wording on the goals is to narrow opportunity and outcome gaps. And we're talking about the outcome metrics. Part of the problem and solution is the opportunity hasn't been there. And so making sure 100% of our kids have access to grade level, standards-based content has been part of the issue, is that our students haven't had that opportunity gap taken care of, which is, why we're insisting on rolling out the updated curriculum, standards-based core curriculum, for example, to those materials so that our students have access to them. That's one lever that we're exercising, which takes time. The curriculum, we didn't have an aligned instructional framework and professional learning apparatus tied to that. We're in the midst of doing that, including this summer, including last week, next week. The assessment system, the balanced assessment system, we now have in place to gauge progress quarterly. The leadership and the continuous improvement activity, the PLCs that our principals are engaged in this week, in fact. So it is, we wouldn't disagree with you that we have to be attentive to a majority of kids while we're making incremental progress, have to be attended to. And you heard Dr. Proctor also list out some of the ways, in fact, that we're going to continue to do that. We're just trying to set some reasonable stretch goals, to Director Scott's point, that are still ambitious. I'm not aware of a single district that has eliminated gaps in 5 years. We are being audacious. We are being ambitious in saying that we're gonna stretch ourselves to try to do so. That doesn't mean that it sits well if folks interpret that as we're sacrificing a bunch of students' learning, because that's not in fact what we're doing.
So it's,
Okay, and then back. I'm sorry. Then back to my original question about the graduation rate. So once again, I asked, can our kids still graduate without being proficient?
I think that would really depend on what we're looking at as a proficiency measure, right? Can a student graduate with a ninth grade understanding of mathematics? Possibly.
I think the short answer is absolutely yes.
yes.
So why are we?
You can just say it. The answer is yes, because I know people that, we all know people. This ain't new. We all know people that they graduated and didn't know how to read. Let's just, I'll keep it 100 every time. We know these people. They graduated our system. They did not know how to read. They played sports very well. They got help along the way. It is what it is, but they got through the system and they weren't proficient in reading. They weren't proficient in math. They were good at sports. They got to college and being good at sports wasn't good enough any longer. That's why we can say that it's generational. So it is. It happens.
And that's my point. Thank you. And that's my point. Why we don't have our graduation rates based on proficiency of them being proficient to graduate versus just the minimum state if they can graduate with not being proficient. Why can't our graduation goals or policies align with being proficient?
I agree with that thinking, Director Hollins, wholeheartedly. One of the things that I learned when I came to Oregon, which is different from other states, is two things. Number one, some states have the requirement for students to demonstrate proficiency on the state assessment as a part of, the graduation requirement. And the second thing that I learned about Oregon is that we have a law that allows for students to opt out, and we cannot require, high school students, particularly in this question, to take that state assessment. I would love, we can definitely do our localized assessments where there is perhaps MAP and such, but it would take some shifting in our practices and some shifting in some current policies. But again, because the state doesn't make it a requirement and there is the opt-out law, we see high percentages of students opting out at the high school level.
I think to that too, just about like the whole using the test. I think it's a metric and it's useful, but I do think students need to know that it's like what we're basing it off of. I did mine this year because I forgot to opt out and I tried this much. And then when I was in, what was it, 8th grade probably, and I took them then, I think students don't realize that like this is what we're basing our goals off of. And I also think that probably is a big contributing factor to why some of these proficiency scores are so low, because kids don't really try all the time in these tests. So if we are going to base it off of, all of these tests that, students do, they need to know that. And I think that's not something that teachers communicate with students. And because, it's just like, I don't think a lot of people try very hard. And
do you think that would be a motivating factor though, if you're like in the
I
third
think,
grade?
I definitely think so.
Maybe
but
not 3rd grade, but high school for sure.
But let me
High
ask,
school.
if the school board revised its graduation requirements for the school system, I mean, it does that periodically, it did that just at the last meeting, and said, high school students, you need to demonstrate a minimal competence, let's say, and anytime between 9th grade and 12th grade, you've got to get at least a level 2 score on the SBAC. Would there be an incentive for students to take it seriously, knowing their diploma is tied towards demonstrating some minimal competency? We could say proficiency, you'll have to get a level 3 to be issued a diploma. We could set that bar however we want to set it. Dr. Proctor's point here is, and your point, is not an incentive to take that exam. In fact, we may not be getting an accurate sense of where our students are at because opt-outs are so commonplace historically here in PBS.
So just throwing something out. Because a D, I mean, we do have a standard, like grading, if you have, you look at grades, a D is not proficient. You could do something like, and PBS has done this before, like in the early 2000s, where we said, even though the state has said, this is what we think the graduation requirements are, PBS said, we think students should have a world language, and PBS added that in. You could do something that sets a standard that is a little bit higher, which is like a diploma, like with distinction, or something that indicates that you've actually met, like, are proficient. So setting that standard versus a standard that, I mean, I'm just gonna, Herman's example, there's lots of kids who, I mean, the data that we got on students getting D's and F's over the last 10 years, there's a lot of students who are just moving along with D's. Now, they don't get credit for an F, but they get it with a D, and they are not proficient. And that's, and some kids, they're super persistent, and I actually applaud that they can go all the way through, even though they're not mastering, because that's got to be hard to be continuing to go through these classes, not mastering the topic, and be persistent and still go to school and try. But I think when kids graduate and then it's like, hey, I didn't, I wasn't proficient, and the consequences then are primarily on the student, like they're not ready for whatever the next thing is. And so maybe there is something we do that sets a PPS standard, like this is what we think graduates, should be able to do. That if you graduate from PPS, that you can read, math, and edit.
The grading policy is a good place, to examine that type of possibility.
So speaking of the grading policy, we're going to talk about that. It's not even the same across all of our schools.
That's right.
So, and so that, I mean, Roosevelt, you can't, they won't let you get a D, but then you go to several other schools and you can get a D. So we don't even have a synchronized alignment on how we grade our students as a district. So That's one issue.
Wait, you can't get a D at Roosevelt?
No, no. If you get it goes A, B, C, fail. Period.
Wow.
A, B, C, fail.
Yeah, and at Cleveland, like teachers won't fail kids usually.
And
I've been involved.
and
in
that's
some schools
and
that
that's
didn't.
therein lies the problem. Therein lies the problem because you can get a C. You can get a C at most schools for coming to school, not starting a fight, and not cussing the teacher out. If
Yes.
you just show up to the school, if you just show up to the school, don't start a fight, sit in a corner, don't cuss the teacher out, you know what I'm saying, and just be there, you can get a C just for showing up. That's just, it is what it is. We ain't gotta like it, but it is. So everybody's, and I'm gonna let everybody keep talking about all the other stuff because I'm trying to really wrap my head around it. As far as like one, I tell Dr. Adams, and I've said it before in the meeting, I'm gonna say it again, he's the man I love to hate. I love this man, I hate him. I do, because the news he tells me is so matter of fact, and I can't argue with it. I want to argue with him and tell him that he's wrong and that he shouldn't provide this type of data. Lie to me, but then I don't want you to lie to me. So he's the man that I love to hate. And so I'm irritated and love him all at the same time.
And one day we want to eliminate the hate because the results are great.
Exactly. And so I want us to, as we're working on that and figuring out how that comes together, I also want to come back to, because I was gone, I wasn't here for most of the meeting. And I want to make sure, like, with the soup, we had an agreement. How does this, because I don't want to see the man not get, you know what I'm saying, what he's supposed to get. Because I feel like anybody that's working hard, doing their part, you should be getting what you're getting, what you're supposed to get. Is there an alignment here? Are we in alignment? Are we out of alignment with what we're as a board holding you to? And how do these two things match up? And the reason I bring this up is because everybody else in the room has talked about the kids, and I want us to keep talking about the kids. I'm gonna be the one odd person in the room that says, "Are you gonna get to eat, or are you just walking home with just your base because you didn't meet the minimum?" So does this allow you? Are you going to be? You know what I'm saying? That's what I'm trying to ask. I'm not trying to say this because I want to hold it back, but I know that we had conversation around when we used the terms alignment, that we were going to be aligning metrics throughout everything. That's what we were talking about. And I haven't heard, and like I said, it could have been because I was 30 minutes late, and for that I apologize. And so
Sure, you're bringing up, we haven't talked about that. Like, where is the alignment? I'll let Dr. Adams talk a little bit more about that. And I hope everybody knows from my time here, I'm motivated in raising student
absolutely.
achievement.
That's without question.
Right.
That's without question. I just want to make sure.
I don't think about that. I think about there's still the same topic area. It's like, are more third graders reading? Are fifth graders better at math? We're measuring, whether we're measuring growth or proficiency. In my case, either one for me is showing or moving in that direction. Now here, this is what we get held accountable to from the federal and state standpoint in our schools, right? And we were just talking about how the students aren't necessarily thinking of it in the same way. You were just talking about and our principals are talking about equitable grading policies, that power of zero. We haven't talked about every time a student opts out, we're getting 0 as a district. So all the kids that are trying really hard that we're supporting to scratch a few more points higher, they're getting averaged down, correct me if I'm wrong, to the student who opts out.
For school-based improvement accountability, yes. When they report our results, it'll just be of the students who took the test, X% were proficient.
So anything we can do to sort of reinforce, our desire that they take it. But as far as how board goals, district goals tie to superintendent's evaluation goals,
there's alignment there. We're talking about OSAS in all areas. There's some specificity and discreteness in Superintendent Guerrero's contract, but these things are in alignment, and one would not have us moving in a different direction than the other.
So can you remind us the goals of the board inserted into the contract were 3 percentage point growth through third grade reading and third grade math for Black children.
Yes.
So
So
this
it's
is
sort of
actually
like a
more aggressive. It's aligned and it's more aggressive. The only place where it appears to be disconnected is graduation because we didn't have a graduation.
Right, because I think all we did was third grade reading and math. So they are
So-
like, these goals are actually a little more aggressive.
Okay, I just needed to be clear because I don't want there to ever be this misconception around, well, nobody ever asked that question. And why didn't we bring that up then? That would have been a perfect time to bring it up. And my grandmother said a closed mouth don't get fed. And I like that.
I would raise a flag, Director Holland, if I had two different field posts. Which one do you want me to go for, right? But these are aligned.
Well, I
I
just
had a
also
question
want to, Director Hollins, you brought up your question about, we're focusing on that there's a very large percentage of our Black and brown kids that we still won't serve even if we do meet the target. And so I don't want to forget that sentiment because I think that's a really important point to bring to the conversation. What do we do about them?
Well, and I think,
And are there interventions? Are there some strategic?
There are interventions. I would defer to,
It's a
I feel like we-
community-wide, this is
Yes.
really dire.
and
I just
so,
want to jump in here 1 second,
Sure.
Dr. Adams, but I feel like, so if we look at our third graders, and Director Hollins, you had all the math already worked out, which I give you kudos for, but like this year, the kids who are in third grade, if 78% of them, let's say that's the number, aren't on target, well, in 5 years, those will be eighth graders. And so we'll see more improvement at the eighth grade benchmark. And then by the time they're seniors, we will have increased that goal even more. So I think that, yes, the way I think about it is it's long-term across the life of a student. And that those gaps, our goal is to continue to shorten those gaps. Like we've got the 5-year goal and then we set another one, but the life of those students is across there. And so we'll continue to do those interventions you're talking about across the life of the student in the system. And be continuing to, and hopefully we will in 2 years say we've met all these goals, now we're going to be more aggressive. But I think for me, it's like we've got to start somewhere and we need to be mindful that we continue to have students not meeting the mark and continue to do the things we've done, which are, the equity funding of our schools, the trying to put more adults into specific classrooms, the racial equity partners, the summer school, all of the strategies we're using to try to support those students that aren't at benchmark yet.
Well, I want to pull us back. We haven't been serving these students for decades. Long before we were board members, long before the superintendent and his team were here, we haven't. We didn't even measure, right, for generations, right? Didn't measure. But finally have some measurements, finally sort of calling out, finally disaggregating those measurements to really say, oh, wait a minute, this gap is huge and generationally persistent and all those things. To me, the most important question is, are we making progress as fast as we can? And I kind of, it's what I keep coming back to, Director Hollins, I appreciated your comments. What's interesting to me is, when we said we're going to go to the moon, we didn't say we're going to go to Mars. We didn't say we're going to go to Vega. We said we're going to go to the moon, and it turned out to be achievable. It was a moonshot, but we achieved it. When we were going to eliminate polio, we said we're going to eliminate polio. We didn't say we're going to eliminate every communicable disease, right, that exists on the face of the earth. We were going to eliminate polio. What I keep coming back to, and I'll admit I just don't know, which is why I keep sort of coming back to ask the professional educators in the room, is this a moonshot? And what I think I hear you saying is yes. And then I think that's where, but it's troubling because I hear all this and I look at it too and I'm like, how can we only have it? How can we not eliminate it? And I guess that's what the framing is really important. If no district or no large urban district has ever done this in a 5-year period of time, and we're able to achieve it, this would be one of the greatest wins in modern education history, right? And we should tout it and say that's great. If on the other hand, different interventions, additional resources, additional things, we could have it in 2 or 3 years and then eliminate it in 5 or 6. Well, we should be doing that. And I think that's where I just keep coming back to this question of what else exists out there that tells us. And again, I'm going to sort of trust that far better than I do. You're saying this is an aggressive goal. But again, if we're getting there in 2 or 3 years, we can recalibrate.
absolutely. Absolutely.
And I'm gonna just agree again with Director Scott. If we set the goal for closing the gap and we get 75% there, that's still going to be an achievement without sacrificing, the morale of not achieving our goals. right? If we get 85% there, it's not going to make it feel like we're a failure because we got 85% there in whatever time frame we're there. So I don't think we have to lower that piece in order to get there to where we need to get.
So I'm just going to remind us all of the 10-year plan to end homelessness, which was an abject failure and actually really set back, right? This was, the federal government pushed it, we adopted it in the city of Portland, we're gonna eliminate homelessness in 10 years. It was absolutely unachievable and no city in America was able to achieve it. I think it actually has had a really detrimental effect on the entire conversation around homeless policy ever since, because, and that's honestly, that's what I worry about here. That if we sort of do the same thing, I mean, I hear you saying it won't matter. I think it will. I think if we say we're going to eliminate the gap and we only get halfway there, there's going to be a lot of questions about, why didn't we achieve it? There's a lot of newspaper articles, everything else about why we didn't achieve it. If we say we're going to eliminate by half and we get there, that's a success. So that's why setting the target is so important. And it's honestly, it's what I'm struggling with. I mean, as we talk through this, I mean, I want to set a more aggressive goal, and yet I don't. If we set too aggressive and we know we're not going to make it, I actually think it does have a detrimental impact on morale and public perception.
Would you set a longer time frame then?
Well, that's interesting. I thought about that. I mean, Director Holland, maybe this is
how you frame it.
You broke up there, guy.
I think it's all how you frame it. I think. Oh, shoot.
We're hearing you. It's all in how you frame it. You're breaking up. You're going in and out, but that's all we heard so far.
I don't necessarily. I mean, like when you look.
I'm going to pretend I know what he's saying. I hope I'm right, but I think the issue is our goal is to eliminate the gap.
Long term, yeah.
Right. We believe we can get there, and maybe it's just a matter of being really clear that is the goal. We think we can have it in 5 years. But we're not
set
stopping.
the audacious goal.
Right.
Right, we are going to eliminate the gap. And our first step is, in 5 years, we're going to make
This is the progress we expect to see towards that elimination.
And is that what each one of these are, is milestone markers to indicate this is what we're going to need? In order to get here, we need to be able to see this at this point, this at this point, and this at that point. Is that what this
the chart,
that chart is? Okay.
Absolutely. We're going to build a rocket booster. Landing craft.
Do we have another plan if one of those engines on that 3-engine rocket goes out? I think that's what Gary is asking. You got a 3-engine rocket, and if one of them goes out, we ain't gonna get to the moon, but how high are we going to climb with 3 engines? And then can we get halfway up there, and is there something sitting out there already that we can attach to where they can actually start working on it to get us the rest of the way? And that becomes the game plan to look at. We still are going to go to the moon, but if one of the engines happens to go out, then we've got a plan in place over here as to where if we can just get to here, we can work on it a little bit more, tweak it a little bit more, and then go the rest of the way.
Maybe we're actually trying to get to Mars, but our first stop is to land on the moon, and then we're going to go from Mars.
Go back to Pluto. They said Pluto ain't a planet no more. When I was at school, Pluto was a whole planet. And now they done took it out.
So I have a question
just
about,
make up our mind.
We've talked about a lot of really important things tonight, and I think, like graduate, what does it mean to be a graduate of PPS? And I think our graduate portrait gets to that, but I think the real world question is, what are our standards for graduation? Do we need to look at those? What does it mean to graduate high school? That's one big thing we've talked about. We've talked about grading and what are our grading policies? How do those look across the schools? And I know that one of the things we've talked about in the past on the board is our report cards and having, I think about some of the testimony Mr. Cruz has brought to public comment about how do we communicate to parents effectively where their students are as one of our intervention strategies so that parents can support students. Because we have students that get A's in elementary school, but then they get the S back and they're not actually proficient at reading.
That's
or the OSA.
That's a fact.
So how do we align those things so that parents can be, I think we've had parents be super surprised when those state assessments come in and they're very different from the grades children are getting in class. So I think that's another big issue. But for me, my understanding is this sort of work session, our main goals is to really say, what are our 4 goals and what do those look like? And then those pieces of our more meaningful high school graduation, what do report cards look like? How do we grade across the system? that those are pieces of it. And then especially using the Oregon State assessments in most ways other than the high school graduation, we've got that. And I think we do still, my understanding from you, superintendent, is the long-term goal still with 8th grade is some sort of portfolio. But again, we don't want to wait on having a driver for our kids' acceleration until we've done the middle school redesign. So we want to like see improvement and start moving forward now, knowing that we'll move beyond testing at some point. But again, we got to start building a rocket. So what is our process at this point? Is this just a conversation? I mean, we can't make a decision, but we will be voting at the next board meeting on these 4 new revised board goals. Is that correct?
But maybe it might be worthwhile to.
Can I have my questions answered about what the process is first?
Yeah. So yes, the plan is the board needs to adopt this form.
Okay,
Yes.
so we're gonna, this is like a conversation to talk through the staff recommendation.
Right.
And then that we'll have in our board book for the next meeting, we'll have a draft that we'll then be voting on. Okay,
This is the draft.
this is,
And
This
then-
is the draft.
Okay.
Feedback, the
Yeah.
direction that the board gives now might change that.
okay.
So
Just,
I can maybe share some, where I think I like that it's moved to proficiency and that it's aligned with the other goals that we had set for the 3rd, 5th, and 8th grade. I, just because I'm a visual person, would like to see the slide translated into like a SMART goal, just so I can see how, I don't know that we don't have the numbers, but just to see how it works, but I can see on 3, 5, and 8. I have an issue with the graduation. Not that it's not a metric, but I also know that our community is going to not allow us to pat ourselves on the back if we close the gap on the graduation rate, if students actually leave our schools not ready for their next steps. And so that's where I'm just not quite, I love the idea of everybody graduating, but I also want it to mean something. And I say this as a parent of a high schooler student, of high school that I said I didn't send to PPS because I wasn't willing to like agree that he could graduate without being able to be.
Can I ask you, Director Brim Edwards, how would you feel about the requirement of a proficient score on the SBAC to graduate diploma?
So maybe in this longer term time frame, and I guess one thing, this is why I kind of propose a little bit, maybe like even the grades until I found out they don't get D's at Roosevelt. But having it be some sort of like an indication, so like the state has set, these are the credits you need, and I think it's a too low standard. But then we have something that indicates that like not only you met the state graduation requirements, but also that you're proficient. So again, I don't know if it's a.
But the question keeps coming up, how do we measure proficiency?
Right, and I see that as the work of the graduate portrait. What you're describing is that higher standard that would be mapped developmentally from kindergarten through grade 12.
Yeah, I mean, but I think the superintendent's question, Director Greenworth, I think this is it seems to be a policy question in some way of, do you believe that putting an assessment as a form of understanding to understand proficiency in graduation, do you, as a board member, believe that to be the direction we should move into?
So I don't know if it. I think I'm open to that as one way, and so maybe it's like you've met, your standard graduation, you've met all the requirements of the state, check, and that there's some sort of seal of mastery that indicates that you actually are proficient.
We're going back to the 1990s, the
No, but
certificate of
no,
advanced
it's-
mastery.
Is the concern that the PPS diploma isn't worthy because it's not gauging a proficient level mastery of our standards? Then I'm asking the question, then do you want to see a proficient score on the state assessment?
I guess what I'm answering is like, it could be that, or it could be that we have unified grading practices across our high schools that actually, it means the same thing, like whether you're at Roosevelt or McDaniel or Ida B. Wells, that like you're getting a diploma because you actually had a level of proficiency.
Well, no, you could still graduate with these. they would just be consistent across all the high school systems.
Maybe.
So
Because
the board can entertain-
we took a whole thing where we took the names off of the papers. We took the names off of the papers and we gave them to a different teacher to grade the papers because I felt like my son was being treated unfairly. And so we took the papers, we took the names off, we took 2 other papers that scored well, and we gave them to a completely different teacher within the school. And my son did amazing, did absolutely amazing. And when we asked why, based on the no names, just based on this grade was given before, this grade was given now, same paper because it's printed out. Why do you think this would grade differently? And the teacher that graded well began to point out a lot of bias in the grading, bias in grading. And so to me, when I start talking about this stuff, and I start, talking about we need some type of a alliance, and I truly believe that we have to deal with the Black issue because I believe our teachers grade, and maybe somebody in here sent to me because I read too much, but I believe our teachers grade our Black boys. They grade them differently. I believe that, I truly believe that they do, because there's absolutely no reason why my son's grade should have went as high as it went with one teacher and as low as it was with another teacher, and both of those teachers were in the same building. So I didn't take it to a whole nother system. I just gave it to the other English teacher. And so to me, we got to deal with the bias. There's a whole issue around alignment and biases, and I don't know, they just don't like Black people. Or maybe I can't say that, but
Which I think is part of your
but
strategic
that's why I
plan.
said I love what he's
It is
saying.
the part.
But it's hard to hear
It's the
because
truth
this has
of-
been going on
Right.
for so long, which is why I believe Gary is asking the question that he is. It's like, can we really afford to lose 70% of the kids? You know what I'm saying? Because, I'm grateful that the higher we can get that number, the better. And I applaud us for even going down this road. I mean, we're doing the right thing. We're doing the right thing. And I think it's equally important to start thinking about, to have a plan in place, because if you're not reading right by 3rd grade, or if something isn't right by 3rd grade, then what does the data say that you're going to be at by the time you get to
4
middle
times
school?
more likely to be
And so
incarcerated.
what does the data say? So even though we're improving our numbers in other places, if we look at the same data, then that number of kids that aren't meeting it, by the time they get to 8th grade, we're still doing a disservice. Well, I should say we. I'm gonna take that back. We're not. A disservice is still being done, but I believe that it's not either or. I believe that it's and. I believe that we need a heavy curriculum. We need to push our kids. We need to raise the bar, because I believe that if we raise the bar, the kids will meet it every time. We just shouldn't lower it down. And then we should be grading equally, fairly, and without bias. And so,
Absolutely.
I wonder how we use like artificial intelligence or machine grading to kind of remove that bias. I mean, so much of our
There's
work at the
concern
city
about bias in that as well, though.
Yeah,
there's bias in that, there's bias on
everything.
Airbnb.
I read that about the by having it run through the system, because it cannot denote the inflection that a teacher, someone looking at it would see what the student is trying to get. They've been working with this student, and so they see, they understand how they think, they understand how they, and they're like, if you let a machine do it, it's just, if it's either there or it's there, and they can be two
And I
different
think
things.
So then the other thing is, we expect the teachers to be grading, it's a subjective thing, right? To grade a group of students, some of whom you might not like.
So directors are pointing out a topic area that our school leaders and principals have brought up. This is why they've spent the last year in a professional learning community talking about each of their school-specific grading policies and are they equitable? And let's get the dialogue going with our teachers, because ultimately it's our teachers that issue the grades. So they're not standardized in some way. And I'm also not knocking our educators, because some of them might have really thoughtful grading policies around how they're tied to the mastery of standards for our students. Is it uniform across the system? I don't think it is in any district. And so we have a lot of work there to do that we're not biasing or.
But will it ever be? Given that every educator,
Is
to your
different.
point,
Right, and it doesn't
That's
solve
different, yeah, I
the
mean,
issue.
human-
And as you recall, in our last district, the school board there decided, well, let's up the requirements. Let's make it a C or better. You still have the same issue, right? But it eliminated the D issue, right? You have to have C or better to meet graduation requirements, for example. That's one angle you could take, but I heard the issue was, is proficiency. So you need a proxy for that. And one way to do that easily is, since everybody's supposed to be taking the OSAS as fact, then, that's one way to make sure everybody does, and it'll tell us something about their actual proficiency across standards. So that's something for the board to percolate on and see if that's a graduation requirement, conversation that it wants to have moving forward. But for tonight, you've heard these are the milestone areas. They still cut across grades. They're still in core subject areas. I don't want anybody to take for granted that these are just going to be easy to come by.
No.
Right?
I'd like to bring, Gary's
rate of
having technical difficulties. I'd like to read out his thoughts. So my suggestion for board goal number 1, to close the achievement gap. 1, close the achievement gap. 2, third grade reading, math, and 8th grade, I think 5th grade math and 8th grade readiness be based on the yearly metrics that are on page 22. And how we get there, change the grading requirement to a C or better. And that we need our degree to mean, our degree from Portland College to mean something. So, our degree should be the gold standard. And the expectations for all of our kids. Black kids can learn just as well as everyone else, but the expectations are greater. That we set standards with, and we support our students along the way. But I just want to.
Gary there, or is that?
Yeah.
So this is the editorial
Yeah,
right there.
that was my editorial, but I wanted to make sure that.
Do we want to do some just last thoughts?
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
what I've
yes.
heard tonight is that it sounds like we have major alignment on most of the areas. I think what I'm hearing is that I think we really need to state that our long-term desire is to close the gap.
Mhm.
And that this is the first step toward, this is not the first step, but this is our next step towards that. So I think that's what I'm hearing from Dr. Hollins is
Yes.
we are going to close the gap. It's going to take some time. This is our first step, and we're going to do some wraparounds for those students that continue to struggle. So that's what I hear from our group. The place I hear the most conversation is around the high school goal. And I miss the pathways. I really loved that there were lots of different ways for students to express themselves, like with CTE or arts or IB or CELO by literacy. I do like the graduation because it is elegant in its simplicity. And I even think if we raise it to C, if we say, okay, graduation is going to require C's or better, we're going to see grade inflation, right?
Yes.
Again, I think we experienced that anyway. So I want us to really thoughtfully think about what does it mean to graduate from PPS, and to think about our students who are neurodiverse, our students who are maybe super artistically gifted and math isn't their thing. So when we're looking at, we want to have high standards and we want to have rigor, and we also want to realize that we have a diverse student population. So how do we, and I'm not saying diverse as in, I'm not talking about diversity of color there, I'm talking about neurodiversity and our what does success look like for our special needs students, and are we fostering that? How are we including special education in this conversation of what does it mean to graduate, and what do those high standards look like across the board? So I would be happy I'd be okay with the high school graduation goal, but I think we as a board are hungry for further conversation about how do we have a high bar for what graduation means in PPS. And I think in a lot of cases it is a high bar for a lot of students. And I think we also know there are places where students pass through, and are they really actually ready for the world beyond? I think that's what we care about, is are our students set up for success after PPS, and that we want to make sure that high school graduation standard does achieve that.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we can incorporate some of this idea about the 7 intelligences that, and thank you, Gary, for texting. If we can incorporate this idea that some people are mathematically gifted, some people are artistically gifted, some people, I think about this every day. I think about what I'm not good at, and then I also think about what I'm very, very good at. And what I'm very good at doesn't apply in the professional world, hardly at all. But I'm proud of it anyway. I wonder if we can talk about, like, help our kids be successful in some area where they're gonna be able to succeed.
And I think our graduate portfolio
Further in
allows for
life.
that.
Right.
Yeah, but
Gary, thank you. It says we can have a PPS policy to take the test for graduation. We could have a capstone project, senior assignment that can test proficiency in different ways. So I think we're, many of us are saying the same things, that we'd like to see, the 3rd grade reading, the 5th grade math is good. And that we might need some refinement around the high school requirements.
but I think for now,
It sounds like,
And to set this audacious goal, I think is.
But it sounds like to me that the high school goal is around the how and not the what.
Yes,
Okay.
because, yes, absolutely,
So
which is
I-
not our job.
I have a few thoughts. One, overall, I like, I've got a couple data questions which I'm gonna ask in a second. Specifically on high school, I don't disagree with my board colleagues that asking what it means and asking if there's something else we need to add in there could be important. But I also am not sure I want to move away from this graduation goal for a couple reasons. One, it is what the state is measuring. It's what has become routinely reported and measured locally and statewide. And so if PPS moves away from that, it's going to get very confusing, right? And that's not to say that we can't add to it. I guess I'm thinking it's not an either or. We can have a goal of eliminating the graduation gap and also have sort of something else that we sort of add on to that. So we can measure 2 different things. This is our board goal for now, but we can also measure how many of those students graduated with at least a C average, right? How many of those students graduated with a capstone? That's work that we can continue to do. I'm just not sure I would throw this out because I think that's going to get confusing. The other thing I have to say I worry about, and this is really tricky because I really appreciate, I think, Dr. Green, you said this, we set a bar high, our students are going to achieve it. But on the other hand, like if we were to say you have to get a 2 or a 3 on the SBAC, then some of our students who would have otherwise gotten high school diplomas will no longer get it. If we say you have to pass every class with a C, some of our students who you said, they show up every day, they persist, or maybe that's Director Burnett, I can't remember. They persist, they do that, and then now we're going to deny them a diploma. That's really tricky for me. And I think we need to really think about the equity impacts of what that diploma would mean for that student. And if we all of a sudden say, you don't get that diploma anymore, that has an impact, right? And so anyway, I think there's a lot to think about, which is why I'm okay moving forward with this while we also think about the others. A couple of really quick data points. I appreciate the conversation about growth versus proficiency. It was not lost on me. And I'm going to say this, I'm going to say it every single time we talk about it. I'm okay measuring proficiency, but I also know that what you measure is what gets done. And so when we measure proficiency, there is always going to be a danger. And it's not because anyone's acting badly or whatever. It's just human nature. Proficiency is what we're measuring. That's what people are going to achieve. And I worry that growth gets lost. And so you're going to hear me every time we get quarterly updates, every time we come back, I'm going to say, tell me about the growth. Because if the proficiency numbers are moving and the growth numbers are moving, we're golden. If the proficiency numbers are moving and the growth numbers are stagnant, it means someone is taking the kids at the border and pushing them over while the other kids suffer. And that is the antithesis of what we're trying to accomplish. So we're going to keep saying that. And then also, in terms of narrowing the gap, and I know this is not anyone's goal here, you can narrow the gap by bringing up achievement. You could also narrow the gap by bringing down achievement. And if, for instance, in year 1, we saw African American, our black student reading scores grow by 3.5%, but our white students fall by 2. We will achieve that 5.5%, but we will not have achieved it the right way. And so I want to make sure we keep focused on that. And I would go even further to say that what would be ideal is that we have that gap in the timeline that we say, well, the white students continue to move up. And that we narrow that gap, well, the white students continue to move up, because some of these white student scores are not particularly high either. And so at the end of this process, we want everyone at 80% and 90% and 100%. So I'll just say that. And I think those were my.
If we make the work well for all students, it becomes even harder to meet these things because everyone's
everyone's moving up.
Well, that's the targeted universalism.
So it looks like we've got some alignment on the first few goals and some work to do on high school goals, and then some policy considerations about mandatory, taking a test, a grading policy that standardizes it to the extent that you can across different buildings. That's a culture shift, perhaps. maybe Roosevelt goes back to giving Bs, I don't know, but
But
Have you
perhaps
heard-
it's a state board conversation that the
Yeah.
board advocates for, because we could up ours, but again, you
Right.
raise the issue around in comparison to other districts in the state.
right.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I wanted to really, and I'm not sure, because again, we're getting carried through text. But I really like the idea of just revising the narrative around these. The goal is to close the gap, and we will achieve X of that within 5 years. And then
It's a smart goal.
moving
The
beyond
framing.
that, right? So I think that framing is the goal.
Gary asked, can we measure both? And I think he's saying both
Yeah,
in
yeah,
regards to
both
proficiency.
We'll
proficiency.
measure both, but our goal will be one.
Yeah. Are we ready to wrap up? Have all the questions and the concerns been,
My thoughts are been out.
Director Hollins?
And you have
Well, I'm agree. They don't have language. This is the language we're doing for this state. The goal is coming forward.
Well, let me reframe the question. What I said, but I'm not sure I heard it from any of my colleagues, I'm okay with this graduation goal
Me too.
as long as we continue to talk about what a more robust standard could look like. But I'm the only one who said that, so maybe we need to go around again.
That's what I tried to say, but I guess I said it poorly. But I said I'm fine with this, but I think I'm hearing a longing for continued conversation about what that means long term. And I liked how Dr. Adams put it. You're talking about the how, not the what.
Because if board members aren't comfortable with that, then we need some alternatives, and I
Right.
think it's up to
Yeah,
the board.
so
to
I'm
put those on the
also
table.
comfortable with it as long as we have some scheduled time to talk about what that looks like.
I'm not okay with just talking about it. Because to me, that's like, hey, we have a conversation about it, so I would want like a commitment that like, we're gonna actually dive into the question, because I think our families will call us on it. And I think the larger community will be like, hey, you guys, like, got everybody graduating, but doesn't mean things. I want, like, I guess I would say, like, I would want something more concrete, then we'll have a discussion about it. I mean, I do think, I think a lot of the work has happened, in some ways already with the last set of goals, because we did say, hey, we're gonna recognize different ways in which students like show their excellence. And yeah, you're gonna have, like, I'm not the arts person, but I'm not gonna show my proficiency that I do through, a strand of CTE. So I think we have that. I think it's more like how we make it more official. Because I think just the diploma is not like, hey, you persisted through to the very end, and depending on what high school you went to, you got a diploma.
So are we willing to support this goal with a commitment to have a conversation about what else we could be measuring, or are you not willing to support this goal in 2 weeks?
Well, I'm all for getting everybody to graduate, but I'm just saying, I don't think it's a true measure of whether our students are leaving PPS.
So
To Gary's point, he's seeing people that are coming that are not prepared.
And I
I think
want
that
to
was a
remind
yes
us
or no
that I
question,
believe
though.
that
Are
is
you
the
willing
work
to
of the
support the
graduate
goal
worker
on-
continuum.
But
Or
I don't
not.
have to answer in a yes or no. I'm telling you what.
Well, because the reason why is if not, then I guess we need as a board to put the alternative on the table. So I know the superintendent asked you some questions about what that would be, and I didn't hear an answer to that either. So I'm just saying that if it is something else.
Well, I'm saying,
what is it?
I was fine with the other, like, I was fine with the board goal we had before. Because to me, it gave us measurements and in different ways for students to be able to show, like, whether they received the seal of literacy, or, I mean, I actually think the work was really, I say, to me, it wasn't that we were not focusing on the graduation rate, but we had looked at what is the post-secondary readiness? And we found ways, I think, really to tap into the brilliance or the talents of our different students by having them show, in different ways.
And we actually showed a lot of success on that goal as well.
We did, but I want to remind us that all of those programs aren't in all schools, so there is huge equity of access issues with the post-secondary readiness indicators.
So we have IB, AP, or dual credit in all our high schools,
And there are other indicators in the post-secondary readiness that are not in all the high schools.
which we have CTE in all our high schools, And I know they're being built out, but which ones?
We can have a conversation about it.
Gary says that he's, board goals for each year need to be based on page 22, which is, I'm assuming is the chart.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that, and then after the first year, we have goals to assess.
Yeah, sure.
So,
That's exactly the, yeah.
and so-
we'll assess them.
and so that was, so I asked him, my question was, what would you be okay with? And
Thank you.
that was his response.
Every fall when we have our results.
So, it will be based on, he's okay with it based on, this year. And I'm, as long as we're, for me, as long as we're very intentional, I do like the idea about having something in writing somewhere, like a chart, like some type of, another chart that you can, I'm sure you've already got one somewhere. You just didn't bring it here. I'm sure he's already got the chart that I'm referring to, but just having that as a visual, but like looking at what I'm looking at here and the understanding that this is actually more aggressive than what we were originally asking for, I would be okay with this. And just reassessing, we're reassessing every year. We're gonna come back after year one to see where we're at, how we did, were we close, were we not, and then make some readjustments.
I want to add, as we have this conversation about high school graduation, I worked in a nonprofit and I was hiring reading tutors, and I would have high school graduates come, and we ended up having to institute a reading part of the interviews because some of our high school graduates that were coming to interview, this was in another state, couldn't read at a 6th grade level, and they were supposed to be reading tutors for 6th graders. So I needed to make sure they were proficient. So I've experienced what Gary has talked about of what does it mean to graduate? What does a high school diploma mean? And I also think about our students, like I went to the summer graduation last summer, and I think about those students who, through working, raising a family, they got the high school diploma. And so I think when we say we want to have it mean something, I think for a lot of students it really already does. And I don't want to minimize that as we're having this conversation. And I think what I'm hearing us say is we want to ensure that our students are set up for post-secondary success. And what is the tool that we can do that? And what I'm hearing from Director Boom Edwards is you feel like the tool we had was a really good one. What I'm hearing from Dr. Adams is some equity concerns around that, and this idea of let's focus on graduation rates, and then the board saying, okay, if we focus on graduation rates, how do we sort of communicate to the public and ensure within ourselves that that really does mean that the students are ready for post-secondary success? So I think we're all we all are caring about the same thing, but it's how do we get there, and how do we set our students up to be those graduates we talked about in the graduate profile.
So I could live with the graduate as long as we continue to report on that other information.
Sure.
And then specifically, I'd like to know like what it is that is we feel Dr. Adams is inequitable, because this has been a conversation that's been going on for 10 years and building things out. And so if it's inequitable to have IB at 2 schools, at AP or dual credit at another school, we should have a conversation about that, because the agreement has been at the high school level that we let different high schools pick their sort of college prep. They all have to have CTE, but they'd be able to pick their college prep, whether it be AP, IB, or dual credit, and that we view those as sort of like different equivalents. So if you think that they're not, I think that's a really good conversation that we should have, because that has been PBS's position. Like, no matter what high school you go to, you don't have to fight to get into Lincoln or Cleveland just because they're IB schools, because we feel AP or dual credit at Jefferson is equal. And if you don't think that, like, we should have that.
I'd love to.
I would love to have that conversation.
And same thing with CTE. If we have schools that don't have CTE built out that you think is equitable, like, we should put that in the budget, because I
would love to have that conversation.
Because that way we can have this conversation of like, what should every student have the opportunity to do? And it shouldn't matter like, hey, you got to go get into that high school.
Yeah.
Otherwise it's too bad.
Sucks to be you.
Yeah, and I also think, this is a great conversation, a great opportunity as we think about the next legislative session. What can you as elected board members do to address this at the statewide level? We have new administration coming in to the governorship and across the board. So we want to make sure that if we all don't believe that the Oregon high school graduation is proficient enough, then we as the largest district and as, let's use our bully pulpit to address that, right? Let's address that head on so that we're no longer at the bottom of education in the country.
And maybe we can, at the same time, encourage our legislators to fund the quality education model.
Fully.
Fully.
We have
Word.
yeah, just before we conclude here. So obviously, like I guess I don't really get to vote on this. But I think in terms of the high school graduation conversation, I think board members should think about whether you're choosing high school graduation for like kind of the emotional benefits of like, oh, I graduated high school, because I definitely think there's a value in terms of that. Especially looking at the other goals, everything is based on, how well did you score on X test, where I feel like high school graduation does encompass more because of our graduation portfolio. But I also think that obviously we've kind of covered that high school graduation or like a high school diploma doesn't necessarily mean proficiency. So when you're evaluating your own beliefs on, why are we choosing it, do you think are you valuing the proficiency of the student over like the kind of emotional benefit of having graduated?
I think it's it's an economic benefit.
Yeah, and I mean, and how do you look at that? Because I think if you're thinking, oh, all of these are to measure kind of the proficiency of our students, then I personally don't think graduation is the best metric. Because I mean, it's different depending on which teachers you get, depending on how good you are in school, emotional, whatever. Like that doesn't really mean the same thing. But I do think there's like a very important part of it emotionally. And then as to the other mention that we were talking about if we did have like SBAC or if we tried to more unify like how we do grading, I don't think we'll ever truly be able to unify grading as long as it's teachers. Every teacher is different. They do different things. Everybody's human. I don't think there's a lot of merit to trying to do that necessarily, because there will always be differences, in my opinion, as students between different classes. Like even if you're at the same school, two different teachers are different, and it's like there's no way to fix that for me. As to the SBAC thing, I understand what you were saying about how, oh, well, we're going to take away some diplomas from people if we implement these higher rigors. But it sounds like all of you also want students to be better, and you want them to have, be more proficient or do X or do Y. So it's like, if you want that, you will have to take diplomas away from people, because that's what encourages them to do it. So I actually really like the idea of the testing, even though I definitely think in ways it's problematic. I think it's the only metric that we truly have to make sure you are proficient. You don't have to get a great score. It's not like the SAT. It's like you have to ensure that you are proficient in it. And I think if we want that, it will come with some impacts to students. But it will also be a motivating factor that if you want to graduate high school and you want to get the diploma, which in my personal opinion is the main driver for taking part in high school, then you need to do it. And I think that's a really important part of like having these things. So I don't think we should take into account like, oh, well, I mean, some students won't get it, which I understand, like maybe that's a problematic thing to say, but I also feel the only way to encourage those students to become proficient and to pay attention and to be engaged is to, put it on the line, put like graduating on the line, because that's kind of when you get to a senior, like that's what you care about.
I also think we want to be careful not to move the goalposts immediately, right? Like if we suddenly say to kids who are seniors next year, we've changed the rules on you that you've been working towards for 4 years. I think we want to make sure we're making change in also a humane way for our kids.
And I also don't know about being what motivates someone at 16. Your brain's not fully formed. I don't know that, like for me, I wasn't like, I gotta graduate. But I think for me right now as an adult, it's the life chances that you have when you graduate, versus the ones that you don't. So it is about life expectancy. It's about being able to buy a home and have a nice car and take care of a family. More than just like a piece of paper, which is meaningless, really. I mean,
and I don't, and that's definitely true.
But I don't know how much of a motivating factor that is. Some people might be motivated because they get to go to band 3 times a week. I'm looking at Andrew.
I'm actually listening to what, so the one person in the room that's still in high school dealing with it. So both Gary and I are giving you that, like, we're over here clapping, like, that girl better preach. Somebody give her an offering, you know what I'm saying? Pastor Trey, acknowledging every word that you said to be solid and on point. Africa is a third world country, and if you don't pass the test, you ain't graduating. You got to pay to go to school, and so that's they believe in it that much. If you could be 6 foot tall in the third grade, but if you don't pass that third grade exam, you don't leave the third grade until you can pass it. And so the rigor, the understanding for rigor that this is important is put on at a much earlier age. And so, you know, should we be doing that? I think we look at how we baby step that in. And I don't think the steps need to be baby. I think it's like, okay, fine, the ones here this year, all right, this is what it's gonna be like, but this is the game is changing. And this is what it's gonna look like. From this point forward, this is what it looks like. Gary's last question, it's not mine, because I said I was done. But Gary's last question is a statement and a question. If we don't have equitable options at all of our schools, then we need to get them. That was the statement. The question is, how will the next year budget affect our current goals? That was the question.
Well, I would say that we're making a lot of one-time investments in terms of curriculum, professional learning, capacity building, which when you build up humans, build up teachers, build up principals, that has lasting effects, right? So if we're spending a lot of money on that, I don't think that there's an impact on next year's budget per se, that it's going to be, you know, I know we're anticipating a very different fiscal reality the year after, but I don't believe it affects next year's budget at all. Okay.
Well, I'm wondering if his question is about being proactive, to think about this before the budget season happens for next year.
I think my understanding is that our goals will drive our budget investments. So if we have less resources, then part of what we say to the superintendent is, okay, we have less resources. What are the main investments we can make that'll drive your goals? So it may mean higher class sizes in certain schools. It may mean loss of certain programs, but then we have to say, these are our goals and this is what we're pursuing and this is where we're going to invest. And this is sort of our value statement.
It's the rubber hits the road.
And then we tailor the budget to those goals.
Okay, I think we are talked out. Appreciate your comments.
Yes, we do appreciate it.
Are we cleared up, Dr. Adams?
I believe so.
You know how to reach us?
Yes. And I'll touch base with Roseanne in the morning.
Thank you, Dr. Brockner, for listening.
As a
I'll call you tomorrow.
Thank you all. Have a good night. Thank